Shalom, brothers and sisters. Again, back at it with the language of creation, chapter 2.
All right.
There's a bait.
All right. This is called Coming Full Circle, the Copernican Revolution.
Wow.
God exiled him, the human, from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. The spiritual and material perspectives have always been in competition because they are fundamentally different. Nevertheless, since neither of these worldviews have successfully subsumed the other, they have learned to coexist and even cooperate in the past. However, a series of important scientific discoveries have dealt a fatal blow to the spiritual worldview, one from which it has never recovered. And here we have the depiction of Genesis worldview, and we see the sun is circling the earth, and you have these branches going from heaven and coming down to earth as a reflection of one another. But then we go to this geocentric worldview, and there's no more heaven, in a sense, heaven and earth. It's the earth, and we know that the sun revolves around the earth. That's when the flat earth type of thing, I guess. And then you have the heliocentric, which is what today's worldview views as the sun in the center and the earth revolving around the sun. And yes. Nick, would you like to continue reading?
Sure. Which part are we at?
After this
thing?
Yep.
The story of the Garden of Eden described...
No.
Oh, lower.
You went
At the meta? Oh.
No, you went too far down.
Right there.
The scientific discoveries illustrated above were not merely technical in nature. They transformed our concepts of space, time, and causality. Ultimately, these discoveries completely undermined the foundations of traditional metaphysics. Therefore, when these changes were taking place during the Copernican Revolution, the stakes were much higher than merely defending geocentrism against heliocentrism. They were also about preserving the spiritual perspective from a completely materialistic worldview. From a scientific standpoint, it would be difficult to justify any attempts to cover up, in quotes, discoveries in order to preserve a debunked model of the universe. However, from a biblical perspective, this seems like a proper response to the tragedy of the fall in Genesis. And then we have... Yeah.
Losing the spiritual perspective. Paraphrase from Genesis 2:3 to 3. God said to Adam, "From the tree of knowledge of good and bad you must not eat, for you will die on the day that you eat of it." They ate its fruit, and their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves girdles. God exiled the human from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. The reason to preserve biblical cosmology against scientific hegemony is that it describes reality at the metacognitive level. Hence, the story of the fall is really about the process of knowledge itself and the dangers of acquiring great material knowledge at the expense of spiritual insight. So, by comparing the diagram below to the previous one, it is easy to understand why the Copernican revolution may be interpreted as a reiteration of the narrative of the fall. Boom.
And so we see the garden, and in the garden, the man was created at the center between heaven and earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Garden of Eden is. It was said to be the
portal.
the connection of heaven and earth where they came together. And that's where man is, and everything stems out from that, right? But then once the eyes get open, what is it? You see the eye in the middle, like the Earth model of, we thought the sun revolved around the Earth, and we see like this, we're still the center,
separation,
but there's a separation. Yeah, everything's not connected. I like that.
right?
Like with heaven and earth, no longer do you really see heaven. And then you see, now we go even further, and we're wandering out in exile, where earth is the furthest thing from the center, right? The sun is the center, not the furthest thing, but we're out on the outskirts.
Yeah, do go on.
And it's interesting because
better though. Hurry up.
in our perspective, we do view the world, and everything is, we're at the center, right? We are the center, and the sun is revolving around us, even though it may not be physically like that, but the perspective literally is like that. And that is a higher perspective,
All right.
more true reality. The story of the Garden of Eden describes a state of innocence where humans occupied a central place in a relatively natural environment. This naive perspective conveniently provided humans with a full understanding of the role in the universe and the spiritual purpose of existence. However, the garden was also a sheltered place. It was a tiny portion of a much greater world. Therefore, as soon as humans looked beyond the limits of the garden, their eyes were open to a strange universe devoid of spiritual meaning. They knew that they were naked and saw their previous worldview as somewhat illusory. Once the bubble had been shattered, all attempts at covering it up were in vain, and humans had no choice but to wander in a meaningless universe until they returned to the ground. At the metacognitive level, the narrative of the fall perfectly matches the plight of humanity since the scientific revolution. So even though these technical discoveries have locally debunked traditional cosmology, they have ironically proven its significance at a higher level. In general, the narratives of the Bible are about humanity's conflicted attempts to reconcile spiritual truth with physical reality in the hopes of acquiring divine knowledge. For that reason, the ancient stories of the Bible will survive and eventually transcend any scientific discoveries as long as we recognize that level of interpretation. Beautiful.
Very interesting.
And so a big problem with today's world is they look at the Bible as though it's trying to explain the physical reality, which is not. It's explaining a spiritual reality that gives birth